In this video, we'll work through a series of examples to help you understand what is a sufficient assumption and what is a necessary assumption. Now, if you're not familiar with the question stems that introduce these question types, go ahead and study this chart. Now, the criteria for the right answer on these questions is different. For a sufficient assumption question, the right answer is something that, if true, if you were to add it to the argument, would guarantee the conclusion, would 100% prove the conclusion. Whereas with a necessary assumption, the criteria is something that must be true in order for the logic of the argument to work. I think understanding the difference between these two kinds of questions is best approached through examples. So let's take a look at our first example. And the visual on the left here is a representation of the relationship between sufficient assumptions, necessary assumptions, and things that would strengthen the argument. So you'll see that the large circle is things that would strengthen the argument. Both sufficient assumptions and necessary assumptions fall within that category. They will both strengthen the argument. It's just that for a sufficient assumption question, the right answer is something that guarantees the conclusion, whereas something that's just a strengthened but not sufficient is going to help make the conclusion more likely. It's going to help the logic of the argument, but it might not actually guarantee the conclusion. So that would be something that strengthens, but is not a sufficient assumption. A necessary assumption is also something that would strengthen the argument, but not all strengtheners are necessary assumptions. And so that's something that you will see through these examples. One thing that I want to point out is that there's an overlap between sufficient assumptions and necessary assumptions in this visual. And that's because there are definitely statements that are both sufficient to prove the conclusion, but are also necessary for the argument to assume. And so that's a point that I made in another video that you should watch if you haven't already done so. So here I've put an example argument on the right, and we have 6 different answer choices. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to categorize each of these answer choices. Some of these answers might be things that are just sufficient assumptions, but not necessary. They might be just necessary assumptions, but not sufficient. They might be both sufficient and necessary assumptions, or they might be neither sufficient nor necessary. And if they're neither sufficient nor necessary, we're going to determine, well, do they at least strengthen the argument? Or do they fall entirely outside of this category? Are they things that would either be irrelevant or weaken? So you can try this on your own first, and then we'll do it afterwards together. So we're told that Kelly and Grace were the only 2 candidates for class president. Whoever got more votes won the election. Kelly received only 50 votes. The conclusion is Grace won the election. So we can tell this argument is assuming that Grace got more votes than Kelly. So let's take a look at each of these answers. One says Grace received at least 51 votes. Well, if that were true, then that would mean she got more than 50, and that would mean she won. So number 1 is definitely a sufficient assumption. Is it necessary though? Well, let's see. Here's how I'm going to evaluate that. I'm going to negate number 1 here, and if it hurts the argument when you negate it, that proves it's necessary. So what if Grace received less than 51 votes? What if she got 50 or less? Well, that would mean she either tied Kelly or got less, so how would you be able to say that she won if she either tied Kelly or got less? So negating number 1 does hurt the argument. That's why it's also a necessary assumption. So number 1 here is going to go into the middle category. It is both sufficient and necessary. What about number 2? Grace received at least 1 million votes. If that were true, she would have gotten more than 50, and so she would have won. So 2 is a sufficient assumption here. But is it necessary? What if Grace received only 999,999 votes? I mean, that's still a lot more than 50, so it wouldn't hurt this argument to say she got less than 1 million votes. She could easily still have gotten more and won the election. So that's why number 2 is not necessary, because if you negate it, if you take it away, it doesn't hurt the argument. So that means number 2 is just sufficient, but it is not necessary. What about number 3? Grace received at least 1 vote. Well, if this were true, that doesn't prove she got more than 50. So number 3 is not a sufficient assumption. Is it necessary? What if Grace received less than 1 vote, so 0 votes? Well, if she got 0 votes, there's no way that we could say that she won the election on the basis of these premises. So taking number 3 away, negating it, would hurt the logic of this argument, and that proves that number 3 is necessary. So number 3 is necessary, but not sufficient. What about number 4? Grace received at least 51 votes from members of the school chess team. Well, if that were true, then that means she got 51, which is more than 50, so number 4 is a sufficient assumption. Is it necessary that she received at least 51 from members of the school chess team? What if that were not true? That would still mean she could get 51 votes from members of other teams? Why does it have to be the chess team? Maybe she got 51 votes from the football team, from just anyone, from a random student. So it would not hurt this argument to say that she didn't get the votes from the chess team. That proves that this is not a necessary assumption. Number 4 is something that is just a sufficient assumption. And by the way, number 4, you can think of as an example of an answer that is too specific to be necessary. There was no reason that we had to be so specific about where the votes came from. What about number 5? Grace and Kelly did not get the same number of votes. Well, if that were true, that doesn't mean she got more than 50, so number 5 is not a sufficient assumption. But is it necessary? What if Grace and Kelly did get the same number of votes? Well, if they got the same number of votes, then we can't conclude that Grace won because they would have tied. So taking number 5 away would hurt this argument, and that proves it's necessary. So number 5 is just necessary, not sufficient. And finally, number 6 says Grace has more friends at school than Kelly. If that's true, is that going to prove that she got more than 50 votes? No, I don't really know what friendship has to do with getting votes in the election. So it's not a sufficient assumption. Is it necessary that she had more friends than Kelly? Well, let's see. If it were not true, if Grace had fewer friends than Kelly, that doesn't hurt this argument because the logic of the argument was about the number of votes. It wasn't about the number of friends that each person had. So taking number 6 away is not a necessary assumption either. So does this even strengthen the argument? Well, if Grace has more friends at school than Kelly, does that in any way help us reach this conclusion? No, it doesn't, because the logic is about votes. It's about who got more votes than the other. That's the principle for who is going to win the election. So if you're going to think that 6 is a strengthener, you're going to have to assume that because Grace has more friends at school, that means more people voted for her. But that's too far because votes can come from anywhere. I mean, we don't even know that these friends were in her class or were eligible for voting. There would be too much of a jump to go from having more friends to got more votes. And so that's why number 6, I would actually put outside of this category entirely. It's not a strengthener at all. And one thing I want to point out is when I went through these answer choices to evaluate whether they were necessary, I was negating each one to evaluate whether that hurts the argument. I'm doing that just to help you understand the logic behind why something is or is not necessary. In practice, when you're actually doing LSAT questions and you've studied quite a bit, ideally you wouldn't have to negate every single answer to tell whether it's necessary. A lot of answer choices you might be able to get rid of because you can tell that the content of it is just irrelevant, doesn't impact the logic of the argument. And you would be able to do that without having to negate it. But if you're not yet at that point, then when you're reviewing necessary assumption questions, I definitely think it's helpful to at least practice negating wrong answer choices so you can see in your mind why they would not hurt the argument when you negate them and why the right answer would hurt the argument when you do negate it. So I'm not advocating for negating every answer choice. I'm simply doing that to help you understand this lesson. Now, one more tip for necessary assumptions before we move to another example. If you have already identified something that would be necessary, then anything else that must be true on the basis of that necessary assumption is also going to be necessary. So that's a way that you can tell what's necessary without having to negate it. So here's what I mean. For number 1 here, if you can tell that this is a necessary assumption, then anything else that must be true based on Grace received at least 51 votes would also be necessary. That is why something like number 3 is necessary. That is why something like number 5 is necessary. Because if Grace received at least 51 votes, she got at least 1 vote. And also, she would have had a different number than Kelly, who got only 50 votes. So that's like another way that you can tell something's necessary without having to negate every single potential idea that you're thinking might be necessary. You could just identify, here's the core assumption that I understand is necessary, and then if something must be true based on that, that's also necessary. So let's take a look at this last example here. Go ahead and try this on your own before we work through it together. Here we're told the judge has been credibly accused of taking bribes in exchange for favorable decisions in cases over which she presides. Even if she's actually innocent, her decisions will never be viewed as legitimate by the public. Here's the conclusion. So, she should immediately resign her position. So one thing I'm noticing here is, well, we don't get a premise that tells us when someone should resign. So one thing this argument seems to be assuming is that if your decisions as a judge will never be viewed as legitimate by the public, then you should immediately resign. That's one thing the argument's assuming. I'm also thinking here that is there any downside here to immediately resigning? You know, when you're making a recommendation and you give one reason for that recommendation, there may be other factors, right? Are there things that would go against why she should immediately resign? Maybe even though the public's not going to trust her decisions, maybe if she immediately resigns, there are some inefficiencies, right? What if the cases that she's handling are now going to be delayed, right? We have to weigh the effect of that downside against the benefit of having her resign. So that's one angle to think about this problem, weighing different factors, pros and cons of immediately resigning. Now, I'm sure that there are more assumptions going on, but that's just what comes to mind when I read this argument. So let's take a look. Number 1, there will be no negative effects from the judge's immediate resignation. So let's see. If this were true, I can see how this would help the argument, because if there are no negative effects from the judge's immediate resignation, then that's basically saying there's no downsides to her resigning. So that doesn't guarantee that she should resign, though. So it's not sufficient. But it does help this argument by helping the recommendation by getting rid of the downsides. So number 1 here does strengthen the argument, but it's not sufficient because even if it were true, you still don't have any principle about when someone should resign. So the last thing for us to do is to think about whether number 1 is a necessary assumption. And this is a really tough but important point. Number 1 is actually not necessary because if you were to negate this and you were to say there will be some negative effects from the judge's immediate resignation, that doesn't actually hurt this argument because the argument wasn't assuming that there's absolutely nothing negative at all that would happen by resigning. It was only assuming that any negative things that might happen don't outweigh the benefit of resigning, don't outweigh the benefit of someone whose decisions are not trusted by the public resigning. And if that's a little bit tough to understand, think about any other argument that's based on different factors that inform a judgment about what someone should do. So for example, if I'm trying to hire someone and I say, and here's my argument, candidate A has the most experience, so we should hire candidate A. Am I assuming that there are absolutely no negative qualities to candidate A? Not necessarily. I am assuming that any negative qualities that candidate A has do not outweigh the beneficial quality that I get from her most experience, from the impact of her experience. So when you're making an argument that's based on weighing factors, if you cite one factor and say, because of that factor, I believe we should do something, you're not assuming that there are absolutely no negative effects or consequences from considering that factor or from making your decision. You're just assuming that the negative factors do not together outweigh the benefit of making that choice. So that's why number 1 is not necessary. And we did establish, however, that it does strengthen the argument but it's not sufficient. Again, it's not sufficient because it doesn't tell you that someone should resign. We have no idea when someone should resign based on the premises in the argument. What about number 2? The benefits from her immediate resignation will not be outweighed by the detrimental effects. So if this were true, that would help this argument because it's defending the argument from the possibility that allowing her or telling her to resign and having her immediately resign might actually backfire and result in negative things happening. Like I was saying earlier, maybe there's delays in cases. I don't know, maybe there were other important functions that she had as a judge that you'll lose and won't be able to find a good replacement for when she resigns. So number 2 is helping the argument by getting rid of the negative factors outweighing the benefit. And this is also why number 2 is necessary. All right. So if you were to negate number 2 and you were to say the benefits from her immediate resignation will be outweighed by the detrimental effects, well, if they would be outweighed by the harmful effects, that would actually suggest that she shouldn't resign, even though the public's losing trust in her. Maybe she's too valuable and she shouldn't resign because it's going to be worse if she does. If you negate 2, that would hurt this argument. So that's why number 2 is a necessary assumption. It is also something that strengthens the argument, but it's not sufficient because even if the benefits of immediate resignation outweighed the harmful effects, that still does not tell you that someone should resign. That's just telling you that it seems like it would be a good thing. It would be okay if she resigned, but we still would need a principle that tells us when someone should resign. So number 2 is not a sufficient assumption. It's just something that's necessary and also by definition a strengthen as well. What about number 3? Making decisions that are perceived as legitimate is the most important function of a judge. So if this is true, that having your decisions be seen as legitimate is the most important function of a judge, I can see how that would help this argument because the premise was saying that her decisions will not be viewed as legitimate. So if that's the most important function of a judge, it seems to make sense that you're not serving your most important function. I can see how that would be a reason now that you should resign. So number 3 is going to help this argument. Does that make it a necessary assumption though? Well, let's see. What if making decisions that are perceived as legitimate is not the most important function of a judge? What if it's just the second most important function? That doesn't hurt the argument because this argument's not saying that legitimate decisions is the number 1 factor. I mean, it is assuming that it is one of the factors, one of the functions of a judge, but it doesn't have to assume that it's the most important function. This is an answer that's just taking things too far. It does help the argument, but it's not necessary that it be the most important because maybe it's the second most important or third most important, and that wouldn't hurt the argument. So number 3 right now is just strengthen, not necessary. Is it sufficient though? And hopefully you know by now, no it's not. Because even if it's true, you still have no idea when someone should resign. So number 3 is not sufficient, not necessary. It does help this argument though. What about number 4? Anyone who is credibly accused of taking bribes in connection with their job should immediately resign. If that is true, then that would guarantee this conclusion because this judge was credibly accused of taking bribes in connection with her job. She took it in connection with decisions that she was presiding over. So 4 is telling us if you fall into that category, then you should immediately resign. So number 4 is a sufficient assumption. Is it necessary to assume though? Was this argument saying that anyone who's credibly accused of taking bribes in connection with their job should immediately resign? And the answer is no, because here the author was not actually focused on only the fact that she was credibly accused of taking bribes. What the author provided you as another reason for resigning was that her decisions will never be viewed as legitimate by the public. So what this author is assuming is that if your accusation of bribe taking is something that makes your decisions not viewed as legitimate by the public, then you should immediately resign. But this author's logic does not extend to just, random people who are in non-public facing roles whose jobs don't have anything to do with being trusted by the public. So if, for example, the argument was about just the head plumber at a local plumbing company, they took bribes in connection with handling someone's clogged toilet a little bit faster, this author is not saying that person should immediately resign, because we wouldn't know that the plumber's duties have anything to do with being trusted by the public. So number 4 right now is too broad. It's saying anyone who's accused of taking bribes should resign. The author was just assuming that people who are accused of taking bribes and that somehow making your decisions not trusted by the public, that is what the author was assuming. So number 4 is sufficient. That means it does strengthen, but it's not a necessary assumption. And finally, what about number 5? Some people should resign their positions, at least in part, because of public perception. Well, let's see. If this is true, does it guarantee this conclusion? It doesn't, because it's just telling me that some people, at least one person out there, should resign in part because of public perception. But that doesn't guarantee that this judge should be the one who is resigning. So number 5 does not actually prove with certainty that she should immediately resign. It's not sufficient. Is it necessary? Well, let's see. What if you said no people should resign their positions in part because of public perception? And by the way, because some means at least one, when you negate a statement starting with some, you turn that into none. So what if no people should resign their positions in part because of public perception? Well, that would hurt this argument, because that's making this second premise irrelevant. That's saying that that's not a reason anyone should resign. So when you negate number 5 and if that eliminates the relevance of one of the premises, that would hurt the argument, which is why number 5 is necessary for this argument to assume. It was assuming that some people, such as the judge, should resign in part because of public perception. Number 5 is necessary. It's not sufficient though. And so it does strengthen though, because it is necessary.